So, welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me properly. I welcome everyone who is already on board to the webinar of the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative that we host in line together with the city of Leipzig during our To Me Summer School, for which we have invited 50 international transport experts from 29 countries. And I'm very, very happy to introduce you to all of them because you have a sneak peek into our summer school. So we will be waiting here for you. And now I have the pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Professor Marco de Brömmelstroet from the University of Amsterdam. He's a professor in urban planning, and he's also initialized Urban Cycling Institute, and he's doing research on the relation between cycling and society. And I'm very happy to welcome you and make him the moderator right now. Okay, all good from our side, Marco. Okay. Seems to be a problem. He cannot unmute. 1 second. Let's see. Okay, now can you try again?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yay.
Yay. Okay. So, are you also seeing me? Can you see me? Yes. Okay. I will try and share the screen. So, okay, it's a bit hard for me because I can't see you now. So can somebody say if you can still hear me? I can't see you or hear you.
1, 2, 3.
Sorry?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So if you can hear me, I will just hope that everything will stay connected. As you can see, I'm asking you to go to menti.com. So I hope all of you can do that and fill in the code 126788. And while you're doing that, I want to first of all want to thank the organizing committee of the TUMI initiative for inviting me to speak to you all at the end of this week. I'm honored to close such an interesting week about mobility innovations. And I was thinking that maybe one of the key innovations is trying out what we are doing now, like interacting with each other, sharing knowledge without actually traveling. So I'm thankful for the organization to allow us to experiment with this, and I hope everything will work out. So let's explore, and I want to explore this by asking you a number of questions. So I hope you're all already now logged into the Menti meter. I'm going to ask you the first question, which is, what is, according to you, the most important mobility challenge that we are facing as society today? You can fill in one word. So what is the most important mobility challenge that we face? And I give you, let's say, 30 seconds to answer, and then we will see. Okay. Equality, equity, congestion, public transport. Wow, I can see I have a very intelligent room already. I see that you have probably already had a lot of discussion about exactly this question. So I'm going to ask you a second question. So safety comes up. A second question, which is related to what you've been doing this week. Okay, let me see. Wait. Okay, what is, according to you, the most promising mobility innovation? So we just discussed the most problematic challenges. So what is, according to you, the most promising mobility innovation? I give you 30 seconds. The most promising mobility innovation. So probably you have been thinking about this for a week. So I'm expecting some really, really deep answers here. What is the most promising mobility innovation? Aha. So I see cycling, very good. Cargo bikes, Hyperloop, mobility as a service, self-driving cars, drones, human drones, shared vehicles. Okay, very interesting. I hope you're not only pleasing me with cycling, but we will talk about that later. So already, thank you very much for giving me this insight into what room I'm presenting to. And I want to start actually my talk with you with a small anecdote. And it's an anecdote from a very interesting book. So I don't know if you can see it, but it's a book by Isaac Asimov. And Isaac Asimov is a writer. He was a writer, and he wrote novels about robotics. And why is this interesting? This is Isaac Asimov, and he was writing this at the age of 19. He was writing his first story about robotics. And at that time, he was studying at Columbia University. And he writes in this book that at that time, there were two main stories about robots in relation to society. So one, and that was the biggest group, was seeing robots as a menace, as something that would, if you would unleash it, would destroy humanity. And the other one, the other group, the other class or school of writing about robots was seeing robots as pathos, as something that would save us all. And he wanted to write a story first in this second group, the second school of seeing robots as pathos. But he found out while writing his first story, which is called Robbie, he found out that he actually found a middle ground. I'm quoting him. He says, "Something odd happened. As I wrote this first story, I managed to get the dim vision of a robot as neither menace nor pathos. I began to think of robots as industrial products built by matter-of-fact engineers." Based on this, he developed this idea of robotics. So from this first story, this is 1939, he developed the idea of robotics, and also I probably heard of that, the 3 laws that govern robotics from that early age. And this is even more interesting if we look at one of his year mates. So this is a student that was also at Columbia University in 1939. He was a year mate of Isaac Asimov. He's called Joseph Engelberger. And Joseph Engelberger writes about how he got sort of passionate by reading these stories that Asimov wrote about robotics. He says that he was fueled by his love of these stories to start and see if he could build robots in this idea that Asimov presented. And he developed is actually the first industrial robot that you see here, which was called Unimate. And in the end, he developed a huge company, and the company Unimation became a world leader in developing industrial robots. He is called the father of robotics, this guy, Joseph Engelberger. So if you think about innovation, you might think that it's actually this guy that is the big innovator. But he already says himself, he's very clear about that he thinks it was Asimov, Isaac Asimov, by writing this story about Robbie, and he was reading it, that really changed his view on what robotics could be. Right, I will come back to this story later. I first want to explore with you the importance, the fundamental importance of language, and especially your language, my language, and the professional language we use to think about the world around us, and especially about mobility. So I'm going to ask you again a number of questions. These are really simple. So look very carefully at this picture, because at the next slide, I will ask you what you have seen, and I will give you 30 seconds. So what do you see in this picture? Aha. Okay, so I can see that we do not really agree with the room, what we see in the picture. So there are some people that look at this picture and see a bird, other people that see a duck, and very smart people in the room, they see that you can actually see both a rabbit and a duck. So let's continue from there. You will get the slides later, so you can look back at this picture if you want. Another picture. And again, I'm going to ask you, what do you see here? What did you see on the picture? A chicken. Interesting. I have to go back to the map to see if that's correct. USA guns. USA guns. Yeah. So many people see the United States of America, or a map of the United States of America. Some of you see guns, and I will come back to that later. So we will go to the third picture. So please describe in very few words to me on the next slide, what do you see on this picture? Animal Crossing, a cycling highway, okay. Really framed around cycling. A deer, yes, a forest. Safety issue. Deer on the road. Yeah, so most people, if I ask this in an audience that I'm live, and most people, or at least the people that scream loudest, they tend to see a deer crossing the road. Okay, I will get back to that later as well. So the final question I have for you to open it is, what do you see here? What do we see here? What did you see on the picture? Intersection. Nice street design. Okay. Well, the funny element of this this little game that we're playing is that none of you is wrong. There are no wrong answers, because there are many different ways to look at that same reality, as you can see. Although most of you here see an intersection or even an example of a good intersection as well. And we will also get back to this picture later. Where's my presentation? There it is. What I want to discuss with you is this statement that I found in a very interesting book about argumentation and planning, and it's by Fisher and Forrester. And it says, what if our language that we speak to describe these images does not simply mirror the world, but instead profoundly shapes it? And this triggered me in thinking, and I want to share this thinking with you. I want to have a dialogue, if possible, about this. Because what if our language does not simply mirror the world? Why is this so important to realize? Well, there's three main reasons for that, and they have to do with the fundamental characteristics of language. The first one is that we need language to describe a complex reality. We need to simplify complex reality to be able to share ideas and to talk about them. Think about a complex thing like love. How could you talk about love without simplifying the concept in, for instance, metaphors? Think about life or time or other complex phenomena. So we need it. It's necessary to simplify the world. But the second characteristic of language is that this simplification is by definition always limited. So we have to simplify the world, but by doing that, we always look at one part of that reality. It's like using a flashlight in a dark room. Our language makes us focus on certain parts of what is love or what is time, and by doing that, it makes other parts of what is love or what is time to be in the dark. So either if you see a rabbit or a duck in the first picture really matters for how you would then approach this animal in this picture. Okay. And this is especially also true for mobility, because mobility, some of us maybe think that it's relatively a simple phenomenon, but actually it isn't. It's very complex. It relates to who we are as humans. It relates to our cities. So it's a very complex thing. So therefore, professionally, we need language to simplify it. And we need, and by doing that, we may have to make very hard choices about what do we see and what do we not see. And why this is important, why this is so fundamental, has to do with the third characteristic of language, and that is called performativity. Language is not only a mirror of the world, but instead profoundly shapes it. So what we see and what we do not see makes us see certain problems and certain solutions while obscuring others. It becomes at a certain, if you develop this, it becomes so taken for granted, the language that we use, that we no longer see how fundamentally and profoundly it shapes the way that we see the world. And especially as planners, we then often not only see it as such, we structure it, we systematize it into a language. It becomes a solid language that we use to make all our decisions. But we should never forget that this same language is not a hard objective science. It is a simplification of reality, and this simplification involves making choices. So this becomes really clear if we look again at one of the pictures we saw earlier. Because some of you already said this or suggested it, but most people see here a deer that crossed the road. But you could also look at the same image as a road crossing the forest. And this seems trivial, but if you start thinking about the same logic of children crossing a road or people crossing a road or jaywalking, you start seeing that these words have profound meaning of what we then see as the problem and how we would develop solutions or innovations. If you see this as a deer that is crossing the road, your focus is on how to prevent the deer from crossing the road. If you see it as the road is crossing the forest, a completely different set of solutions comes to the fore. So think about what this would mean for thinking about urban mobility futures. My argument today is that I think in our field we run the risk of being stuck in what I call conceptual laziness, in the idea that we have certain concepts of looking at the world, they are fixed, they are solid, and we keep using them. And I want to challenge you to open up that black box and to start questioning that language. Because especially professional language has this problem because it gets solidified. And at first, it can become fluid. It can become something that we can change, that is liquid, under very high pressure. But then at a certain time, over time, a consensus develops with policymakers and engineers, and then this process of solidification starts. So we choose certain metaphors, we choose certain language to describe a certain reality, and then we develop it into standards, systematize it into models, and even into institutions. We solidify it in technologies, design guides, and in the end, we solidify it in concrete and steel. And when this whole process is finalized, this language has become concrete and steel, we could speak of a radical monopoly. That's what Ivan Illich wrote already in 1973. We no longer see that our way of looking is limited by our language. We take it for granted. And not only as professionals, but the entire society does it. Policymakers look in the media, look at the day-to-day discussions that we have. So if you want to understand what happened to where the metaphors and language of mobility come from, you have to go back all the way to the 20s of last century. At that moment, there was this moment of high pressure, and this was caused by the mass introduction of cars to the streets, especially of American cities. There's a great book, Fighting Traffic, by Norton, who wrote about that. And he says that in the millennia before this, the street was a place of meeting, of negotiation, of trade, of games, and such. And this rapid introduction, mass introduction of the car put pressure on that same street. At the same time, there was massive injury and fatalities on the street, and this brutality made that we as society in the 20s needed to find a solution for this problem. At that time, civil engineers were seen as very good in solving problems. They basically also solved the problem of water and sewage, and they were asked to do it. And what then happened is that their choices that they made to approach this problem often came from sewage and water logic, they were used, standardized, systematized, and in the end depoliticized. And most of these choices we take for granted to this day, but we don't have to. So what does a traffic engineer see? And this is a bit of a simplification because our time together is short. But what traffic engineering sees here is built on, I would say, 4 key metaphors. A professional that developed the new language of the street based on this idea of the automotive city in the 1920s, developed a whole new language. And the first one was based, and you have seen this week, on the idea that the city is a puzzle. It's not a mystery, it's a puzzle. And a puzzle means that you can solve it. The city in the 17th century already was increasingly seen as a body, a human physical body. So we were talking about arteries, about flow, about blood, about the heart. And we're still doing that today. I want to show you one example that you have seen this week. The traffic is the heartbeat of a city, or traffic can be a heart infarct. This is a way of talking about mobility that is so natural to us that we no longer see that it's just a metaphor that shows one part of mobility, but also obscures others. So in the time after this puzzle, from a biological puzzle of a body, became much more during industrialization. It became more physical. It became more of a system of a technology. So we used all kinds of metaphors from the physical sciences to describe this reality, as the gravitation model or the idea of particles that would collide. So that's the first one. The city is a puzzle. The second one is the human in this city as a Homo economicus. So we borrowed this logic in the 60s and 70s from economy, right? So the economics were relatively strong in explaining choices that people made in the microeconomical logic. And traffic engineers borrowed that logic to be able to measure or at least analyze and predict traffic flows. But this model, I hope that you know about the Homo economicus model, assumes that all humans are individual, egoistic, calculating, relatively cold individuals that maximize their own utility, right? Which is partly true, we are partly that, but we are so much more than that. So this is a model of humanity that only focuses on this small element of who we are, utility maximizing individuals. And importantly, connected to the puzzle, being underway is a disutility. It's a derived demand. You want to go from A to B because that's where the utility is. Being underway is a derived demand and it's actually called a disutility, something you want to minimize. And this has profound implication. Because of this, travel time savings became the main goal of traffic engineering. And we still think, I think most of us think that is, yeah, of course, we want to save travel time. If you can be faster from A to B, why not? And this is why probably, I don't know how it is in your country, but in the Netherlands, every half hour on every radio station, even during Christmas, we get traffic congestion. We hear where the traffic congestion is. And we take that for granted. We think it's normal that every half an hour, we all need to know where there are traffic congestion, where travel time is being lost. Okay, that's the second one. City as a puzzle, human as a Homo economicus. The third one is interaction is a conflict. Because if the individual is a rational, selfish, optimizing individual, if you look at this intersection, they cannot trade off. They all want to have the right of way. So you have to think about how to solve this, how to avoid that people get into conflict. So every interaction on this intersection can be seen by engineers as a conflict. So when you solve this, engineers would proudly say that this would be a conflict-free intersection. Everybody on this intersection, even the pedestrians, the people that walk, and the cyclists, they have their own place and their own time. So in Dutch, we have a word for that. It's not a traffic light, but it's a VRI. and it literally translates as verkeersregelinstallatie, which would translate into something like a traffic management system. So this whole idea of interaction between humans is reduced to a conflict that needs to be solved through an external rigid technology, right? Okay, so we have three now. The fourth metaphor is, because of all of this, efficiency. This whole thing, this intersection, but the entire system, the puzzle of the city, needs to be as efficient as possible. If somebody loses time, it is a problem. It needs to be solved. And because of this, again, it seems logic, but because of this, we fail to see that you can also approach this, for instance, as a justice question. So is this way of organizing public space just, instead of is it efficient? Because of this efficiency, many things needed to be cleared out of the way here. For instance, and I hope you're familiar with that, the idea that the traffic industry, and especially the automotive industry, invented the word jaywalking, because we wanted to clear public space from people that were just hanging around, because that was not efficient. You were blocking the flow of traffic. Zebra crossings is the same thing, or even playing grounds for children did not exist before traffic engineers came up with that idea. So because of this, speed becomes the dominant design variable. So I want to ask you a question, and please be honest with me, or as honest as you want to be. And it's this question: do you think that your thinking during the last week has been influenced by at least one of these four metaphors? So has your thinking been influenced by this idea that mobility is something that needs to be efficient, a puzzle that needs to be solved, a Homo economicus logic of disutility, or interaction as a conflict? It's nice to see that you're such an honest audience. Because, yeah, of course. Okay, so there's work to be done, I guess. So let's see if we can discuss what has happened to us, to all of us, in this thinking. And one element here has to do with this graph. What you're looking at is a graph of average travel distances of Dutch people. And on the left is 1950, and on the right is 2012. And what you see here is that it's a very clear sign that the four metaphors that we use are so limited that we do not capture the most important elements of reality. Because what you see from the left to the right is, although we invested every year billions in travel time savings, on the left, an average Dutch person traveled 1.5 hours, and on the right, the average Dutch person still travels 1.5 hours. So not a single minute has been saved. But instead, what happened is that the travel distances increased. So what you see here from the left to the right is that people travel the same amount of time, but much larger distances. So instead of the idea that the Homo economicus is saving a disutility, people use higher speeds of the network to actually optimize very different goals. So apparently, we don't really capture what drives people. So instead of this as a gravitational force, bringing cities closer together, these investments that we're still doing today, improving traffic flow on highway networks, for instance, or making a hyperloop, would even not bring places closer together, but probably also lead not to gravitation, but to centrifugal forces. And that's really problematic, right? If as society, we are pushed further and further apart. But this is not the real problem, though. I think the problem goes even deeper. If we keep focusing on travel time as a disutility, and if we keep working together on making travel more seamless, if we emphasize efficiency over justice, we are developing together a future which optimizes the machine and marginalizes the human. Optimize the machine, marginalize the human. So the four choices I discussed, the four metaphors, are limited. They don't really describe reality well, but they have created a reality already. And if we keep unreflexively going forward in that same storyline, the same narrative, all our thinking goes into this future. And this is not only in the Hyperloop, which makes travel faster. This is not only in the self-driving car that makes travel time irrelevant because you can Facebook or Netflix or work. This is not only in mobility as a service that makes seamless mobility as comfortable as possible, but it's also in bicycle highways, in e-bikes, in smart connected bicycles, and so on and so forth. The logic is everywhere. So before I start this, this was the first part of what I wanted to share with you. The idea that this language leads us to potentially a problematic future, but nothing is lost yet. Because if you learned something from Isaac Asimov, there's something we can do. We can question this language. We can even create together new languages. And why this is important, I want to let you watch a short lecture by Lera Boroditsky. She's a cognitive scientist and professor in the fields of language and cognition.
Now, the beauty of linguistic diversity is that it reveals to us just how ingenious and how flexible the human mind is. Human minds have invented not one cognitive universe, but 7,000 languages spoken around the world. And we can create many more. Languages, of course, are living things that we can hone and change to suit our needs. I've told you about how speakers of different languages think differently, but of course, that's not about how people elsewhere think. It's about how you think. It's how the language that you speak shapes the way that you think, right? And that gives you the opportunity to ask, why do I think the way that I do? How could I think differently? And also, what thoughts do I wish to create?
What thoughts do I wish to create? How beautiful. So can we make a shift together from conceptual laziness to conceptual leniency? Can we learn to reflect on language? And through that, can we learn the art of using metaphors to walk around reality and to see that it has a different shape if you look at it from different sides? I think if you are able, or all of us are able to do that, continuously shift and be reflexive on the language that you have to use to simplify the world, we can create a future where not the machine, but humanity thrives. And I give you one example, but please see it as an example, right? So this is one example of how to do it. And I hope that you can see that you can develop many more examples like this. Welcome to human land. I think the Dutch cyclist, and especially the Dutch cyclist, is an ideal boundary object to develop a new language for transportation thinking. This has to do with the peculiar characteristics of this species, which is they sit upright, which is very unaerodynamic. They're open for interaction. They can send offers and agreements. They can negotiate. So they can escape the logic of being a Homo economicus. They can escape this idea of being only a disutility minimizing species. And they're open to see each other's diversity, which is very important. So they might be able to help us developing a new language. And this is, I came to this conclusion because of a simple observation I had, is that if you look at this new thing in many cities, cyclists are regaining dominance, pedestrians as well. And there you can see a very interesting thing, is that if we talk about them in the same language that we use to talk about mobility, you can start seeing that there are cracks in the logic, right? So this explains, I think, a lot of the frustration and the anxiety we hear about cyclists and pedestrians in the general mainstream debate. Because just think what the goose on the left, in this logic of the goose, thinks when the goose sees a swarm like on the right. How can this possibly function, right? How can they do it? What an absolute chaos. Why do they not have clear rules like us? Why don't they behave according to the rules? Where's their discipline? And most importantly, it has to be so dangerous. The field has to be covered with little bird bodies. Why do they not wear helmets? I would say this is an example of conceptual laziness. So what if we shift? And what if we say, hey, let's look at the swarm itself and see if we can develop a new language. And if we can develop a new language, maybe we can develop a different future. Because have you ever looked at a swarm of starlings at night and wondered, how do they do it? Or why do they do it? So this might help us to think about conceptual leniency. Well, in very general terms, if you want to understand the swarm, you cannot look at the general form of the swarm. Averages are meaningless. There's no equilibrium, there's no overall logic, there's no leader, there's no clear goal, there's no shared goal. It's a game, it's a dance. And in the dance, each starling bases its individual behavior on personal rules. 3 simple rules. Be as close as possible to the middle of the swarm, don't collide and follow the same direction and speed as 6 of your neighbors, and trust each other that everybody is following the same rules. This is what we call the magic of the swarm, and complexity theorists call this emergence. The idea that what we see overall are patterns that are guided by the individual behavior and not by the behavior of the overall group. And humans do this all the time. So just think about how many times you clap when you give an applause. How do you decide when to stop? Or think about how high or how loud you have to talk with a colleague during drinks, and how this decision is based both on the sound of others, but also influences the background sound of that. So this continuous interaction between individual choices and the environment, that's what creates emergence. But emergence has no place in mobility, right? Because people are selfish. They don't negotiate. They are just optimizing their own utility, and they're often in a cocoon. So they can't even negotiate. If you're in a steel cocoon, it's really hard to develop a concept of offers and agreements. So the car does not allow for this, but the bicycle, and especially the bicycle where you sit upright, offers the ideal conditions for emergence. So this gives us a new understanding, a possible new language of understanding the how. How do people travel through space? Here on these pictures, you see that instead of being 15% human and 85% technology, as a car, humans on a bike are 85% human. So we need to understand much more about the human element that is involved here. There's 2 differences here. If you look at this versus car drivers, and one is that they're very open for communication. So they actually don't need many external rules or traffic lights. They can negotiate, and they have direct and very precise control of their bicycle, especially the Dutch bicycle with a back coaster pedal brake allows you to really dance together and interact. And what you then see is emergence. So what you see here is emergence. You see that people interact. You see also, by the way, very important in this short clip, you see many different people. They interact. It's not always nice. They sometimes bump into each other, but nobody gets hurt. There's a lot of learning. There's a lot of offers and agreements sent. An important element, as I already stated here, is the diversity in this clip. So we now know a bit more about the how, a new language of the how interactions, but there's also interesting elements of the why. So why are people underway? And what you see here is what sociologists call a potential exposure to diversity. Because if you're underway, you're actually exposed to a lot of diversity that is often not available in your work or in your home location. But underway, you meet all these different types of people, you interact, and you negotiate. And this potential exposure to diversity has very strong effects on how we function as people and as society. So what we did is we did a literature study to find out what are the potential elements that could be influenced through this potential exposure to diversity. It's a sense of membership, sense of influence, sense of integration. People feel a higher fulfillment of needs, a more shared emotional connection, sense of neighboring, collective efficiency. Citizen participation goes up if people are exposed more. They have a higher sense of community, a sense of belonging, a higher sense of place, and they have higher trust in each other because they negotiate all the time with different people. They have lower prejudices to other people. So this gives us potentially a new why. So maybe mobility is not so much about an efficient network only, but it's maybe more about bringing people closer together. Okay, so I'm going to ask you again to answer the first question that I asked in the beginning. So let me see if I can quickly go there. Come on. So I want to ask you again the same question. What do you think, now considering maybe this new language, what is the most important mobility challenge? Give you again 30 seconds. What do you think is the most important mobility challenge after hearing this story? Aha. Right. So one joke, so I did this game before with engineers, and one joke that an engineer made in a room, but I think it was spot on, is that basically in the last half hour, we solved congestion. Because it's no longer a problem. If you develop a new language, you see very different problems and probably also different innovations. Because we are not going to do this game now, but if you would use this word cloud to then consider your answers on this word cloud, you can really think about, is really the Hyperloop a good idea? Is mass a good idea? So maybe our innovations are really tainted by the language that we use to understand the biggest mobility challenge, right? So if you go back to this slide, I ask you to check out the first and the last mobility challenge question I asked, and to see how different these word clouds become if you start developing a new language, okay? So I will close this talk by linking all of this to this question of innovation. Because what if our language does not simply mirror the world, but profoundly shapes it? What more things can we see if we look at this than only an intersection that needs to be as efficient as possible and minimize this utility? Maybe the street is a place to meet. Maybe this is a public space to play or to be. Maybe the human here is not only a Homo economicus, but also a Homo ludens, a playing human. Maybe being underway, traveling, is also an important value in itself. Maybe interaction is not only conflict, but it's also meeting each other, a very important element of societal functioning. And maybe the city is not a puzzle, but maybe it's a theater, a place of diversity, which will always be organic and chaotic. So let's link it to innovation, and you're thinking of the last weak, because I think we have now seen how this language developed over time. We can see how it influences the way that we see what is outside, but more importantly now becomes the last element, the performativity of language. So if we do not reflect on this language, this will propel forward in our innovations. I'm going to ask you a question again, so let's go back. Okay, so this is a newspaper item from 2015, and it's Uber, but you can fill in almost any company, Lyft or whatever, and they made a pitch. They said, well, our innovation will be the solution to world congestion, to public transportation problems, to safety, and so on and so forth. So this company already at that point was worth a couple of billions of euros. But I want to ask you this question. So we are now 4 years later. So what became of this promise of solving congestion? And I give you 4 options. So how much congestion reduction happened through ride sharing? And I'm asking this, you can add up the effect of Uber and Lyft. So was it 40%, 30%, 20%, or was it 10%? In 2015, Uber already had 1 million drivers across the world in more than 300 cities. They were worth over $50 billion. So how much of the promise did materialize? Well, some of you might already are on to me, because this is a trick question. Because nothing happened, or even worse. So now we are 4 years later, and instead of 40, 30, 20, or 10%, we have seen that the actual numbers are much worse. Ride sharing is not getting people out of private vehicles as much as it is getting people out of public transit and people that are walking or biking. So if you add up the numbers from this study of 2019, you will see that this leads to a 59% increase in car traffic, and significantly increase in car traffic during peak hours and on very heavy duty links in the network. And also, especially in Amsterdam the last year, we have seen that not only did this not materialize, their promise, also 3 people got killed by very young Uber drivers that also do a job that is not really fulfilling, and so on and so forth. So if this did not only materialize, it created all kinds of perverse effects. And this is why it's so important, because what happens is that every time a technology trigger comes, an innovation comes, they get all kinds of attention. And this is nicely captured in this, what is called the hype cycle, this idea that every time a new technology enters the debate, we have very high expectations of what it can solve. This is partly triggered by the companies themselves, and especially recently, when these companies are chasing what is called the unicorn effect. So they want to grow very fast. So they are overselling their product. And not only Uber, but also self-driving cars, bike sharing products, and even the kick scooters that we see around the world. And at this first part of the curve on the left, we see the importance of language, because the language that is used here is by Elon Musk and others is often the language of travel time as a disutility. So we are here on the left side developing companies that are worth 15 billion euros or dollars based on a language that is very limited. So what if we could improve that? Now I'll show you the example of the self-driving vehicle. So this is the Gardner hype cycle. They fill this in every year. In 2010, autonomous vehicles entered the hype cycle as one of the few mobility innovations and as a new innovation. So this is 2010, 9 years ago. And then over the years, it evolved until 2015. And at that moment, it was on the top the peak of inflated expectations. So autonomous vehicles is here, as you can see on the top of the graph. So I was interested in how was the academic debate at that point. So we are already 5 years in the process of autonomous vehicle development. The company is worth 50 billion, right? They have already huge amounts of investments. Waymo has been developed and so on and so forth. So autonomous vehicles are actually hitting the road around that point. So what did we do in terms of studying? So luckily, at 2015, these two academics developed a literature review of all the studies that have been done to study automated driving. But if you look at this pie chart, you will see that almost all of this, or maybe actually all of it, is about the technological elements. There have been no critical examinations of the potential devastating effects or the potential expectations of these technologies on cities and humans. And what of course happened afterwards, as the hype cycle already suggests, is that these cars hit the road, literally. We see all kinds of new problems, and they enter the trough of disillusionment. So we are now in 2018, and we are all the way over there. But I hope that there's a bigger problem on this graph, because we are all already aware we are developing critical stance as society towards autonomous driving. But at the same time, here on the left, we see already the new hype, the flying autonomous vehicles, the human drones are coming. Autonomous driving level 5 is over here. So this hype cycle will keep continuing. So we need to develop a stance towards what they are doing to shape our future. Because this is the CEO of the self-driving car company, Waymo. And basically, he already says now that he is also not believing in it anymore. He says this will never happen. And actually, if you read this, how great would it have been if in 2010 we could have told him, hey, self-driving cars cannot function in our cities. Maybe you should focus on developing the technology only on a highway system. Then we would have spent all our energy and time in a much, much better way. So what can we do about it? We can have a development of reflexivity of language. And this is developed in this adaptation of the graph, the hype cycle, by Dave Algoso. And especially on the left, I really enjoy this roundabout of repackaging. The idea that every time an innovation comes, instead of just accepting it and developing it and putting all our money in it, we could have a good discussion about what is this innovation bringing to us? What does it potentially do in terms of damage? And can we then develop better solutions? So, to close, I hope you're still there. I have no idea. What if our language does not simply mirror the world, but instead profoundly shapes it? Then, if this is true, it is crucial to understand what choices have been made in our mobility past, and to become reflexive about how this language structures and frames our thinking about our mobility presence. And even more importantly, it becomes a powerful weapon to shape our urban mobility futures. Think about Asimov. Isaac Asimov, 19 years old, he developed a complete new understanding of how, as society, we could relate to robotics, and as such, changed the future of humanity. I presented one example of how a change in language can lead to radically different views. A view that sees being underway not as a quantity to be minimized, but a quality to be maximized. That puts not efficiency, but justice central, and that sees interaction not as a conflict, but as a meeting, an important condition for a well-functioning society. Now I leave you to think about your own language. You can be the Isaac Asimov of urban mobility futures by changing our common imaginations. And you can inspire the next Joseph Engelsberger to start building this more human-based mobility future. So in closing, I would say that true mobility innovation is not about gadgets, technologies, and solutions in search for a problem. It is also not about redefining problems and challenges as such. Instead, true innovation might be about inventing alternative languages. Thank you very much.
thank you, Mr. Brömmelstroet, on behalf of the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative, the City of Leipzig, and all 50 transport experts from around the world. And I saw we had about 50 participants in this webinar. Thank you very much, Professor Brömmelstroet from the University of Amsterdam.
Welcome.
What we will try to do is also to have time for some questions, and we will start with the ones here in the room, and then I will try to also handle the chat a little bit. So if there's anyone in the webinar who has a question, please do so, write them in the chat. So I would start here in the room. Is there a question to Professor Brömmelstroet? And okay, Andre, please stand up and try to be really loud. Let me know if you understand that.
Hello, thank you for presentation. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, super. Just from your experience, what is the best way to change understanding of situation for people? So how to change the mentality?
The mentality of who?
Of people for whom it's going to be improved, this mobility.
Okay. Well, that's a very, very hard question. I would say it's already something that we realize that the language we currently speak already influences what they see as problems and solutions. So if you hear every half hour on every radio station that congestion is a problem worth speaking about every half an hour on every radio station, obviously you're going to think and take for granted that we should spend all our public money in solving congestion. So one of my proposals is, let's stop doing that. Let's save all this time. And once a week, we talk on the radio about traffic fatalities. And we speak about who has died on the road that week. In the Netherlands, about 15 people every week. And we talk about who they were, who they are leaving behind, and what happened. So by changing these kinds of things, I think we can also change the public debate. And in the end, the way that we spend money. Is that an answer?
Okay. Another question? Okay, I have a look in the chat also.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, if not so far, I have a question from my side here from the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative. You said we need to change the language of our transport planning, so to say. And we had here a workshop on communications and to really try to find a better voice for our sustainable mobility projects. What are your recommendations? How can we, or what are the 3 top things we really need to do when we think about communications and public relations to really bring out the impact that we want to have to bring more sustainable mobility options to our target groups? What can we do in terms of communications and public relations?
Yeah, I would to say there are 2 very interesting examples currently in the Netherlands where the Dutch railways, for instance, realized that they were selling their product in the same language of what they see as their competition, which is car travel. So they were continuously talking about travel time savings in the train, travel time reliability, and so on and so forth. And actually, in that language, it's very hard at many places to beat the car, right? So they decided now to develop their whole entire marketing around concepts on which they are actually much stronger and on which the car can never compete. So one element they now introduce is adventure, for instance, or in many of their advertisements, you don't longer see a train. You see people that meet each other and that have a nice interaction, that flirt, that even develop relations. And the same thing happened at the same time with the Dutch Cyclist Union, that instead of selling cycling as something that's faster, more seamless, actually selling it as basically an alternative for the car, they said, no, cycling is also about happiness. So being on the way can actually be a very profound experience of freedom, of happiness, of creativity. So developing these kinds of things, and we should, I think, if we become reflexive about our own language, start talking about different things. So not selling sustainable mobility as something that is as fast or as only greener than the car, because we will lose that. There will be green cars in the future. there will be electrical shared self-driving cars. All right. If we want to get people out of there and want to develop cities that are not car dependent, we should talk about different qualities that cities can have. So final example of that is I think we should stop talking about streets as places of flow. Instead, streets are public spaces. So I don't know how many people in the room are actually landscape architects, for instance. I can see you, so if you can raise your hand if you're a landscape architect. Nobody. Maybe we should have a next meeting next year with landscape architects and see how they can help us understand streets, not as places which we divide along people in modes, but instead see as places of public value.
Okay, thank you. I don't see also questions in the chat, so I really would thank you for making this little experiment together with us, hopping in our summer school also with a webinar. So thank you very much for that, and we give you an applause and wish you a very good day.
Thank you. Bye.